welcome back, I guess, if you've been following along. Last time I was chatting with you guys, I was sharing all of the seeds that I will be starting for my 2025 cut flower garden. And as some of you may know, I own and operate a very, very small scale, if not micro-sized flower farm located about 15 minutes north of downtown Milwaukee. So we're relatively urban. And while I love growing that many flowers, and I love growing flowers on that scale, you definitely don't need to be a flower farmer to start your own cut flower garden. I started Brew City Blooms on our very tiny urban duplex lot in a couple of raised beds and a bunch of pots nestled on my front porch, so it can be done on a very small scale. What's nice about cut flowers is there are tons of varieties that are extremely abundant and will pump out blooms for you in large quantities, so you don't need a large footprint to really get going. So with all of that in mind, today I wanted to show you guys how to start your own seeds for your cut flower garden. I'm going to be showing you how to start your seeds indoors, and the benefit of starting them indoors is you get a jump start on the season. So by starting them that much earlier, you're going to have blooms that much earlier when summer really gets going. You don't need to start them indoors. I do want to mention that. There are a lot of varieties that do really well just getting sprinkled out in the garden. So if you want to bypass all of this, that is definitely something you can do, and might be another video that I'll show when the temps warm up a little bit. We're going to start today by going through the materials that you're going to need if you're starting your own seeds. So the first thing being seeds. You actually need some flower seeds. And if you need some ideas for seeds to start, you can look back at my last video where I go through everything that I'll be starting this season. But if you are really a beginner and you've never started flowers before, or maybe never even had a garden before, there's a couple varieties that are great for beginners. Zinnias being one of them. They are this very beautiful, abundant flower, and more recently, they're coming in really beautiful colors. So a zinnia is a very foolproof beginner flower, and then another is cosmos. Cosmos are one of my all-time favorite flowers. When you are cutting them in summer, they smell like a fresh Granny Smith apple. They're incredibly airy and whimsical and beautiful. And same as zinnias, they're going to give you just a ton of flowers throughout the season. So those would be two flowers I would recommend starting with if you're really new to all of this. With that in mind, I do want to say before I get much deeper into this video is going to be geared towards a beginner. I don't want to mansplain things. I don't want to dumb things down too much, but I also don't want to leave anyone with a ton of questions when they walk away from this video. If you're a little more experienced with gardening or with cut flowers, a lot of this may be information you already know, but I hope some of the information, like my seed starting soil recipe, will be new and exciting for you at least. So let's get back into materials. First thing is seeds. Once you have those secured, you are going to want something to actually start your seeds in. I've used things in the past like egg cartons and toilet paper rolls, and you can certainly use those if you're just dipping your toes into this. But if you think you're going to be doing this for a couple seasons, you may want to invest in some seed starting trays of some sort. So the first option would be a true seed starting tray, and that's going to look something like this. It comes with three components really. The first being this humidity dome, and this will be important when we actually get into starting the seeds. So a humidity dome. And then you're going to have your seed cell tray. This is the bit that we will actually fill with soil and lay the seeds out into. This is a 72 cell tray, and that's a really good starting place if you are just a beginner and wondering what size to get. A 72 tray means that we can fit 72 seedlings in here. So you'll have that seed tray. And then the last component of this is the bottom tray, and this will be really important for watering, which I'll share when we actually have a tray filled. So that is what a standard seed cell would look like, or a seed starting tray would look like. You can get those at your local garden center. Johnny's Selected Seeds has really good quality ones that last me season after season after season, so that would be another place to look as well. And the other option I am definitely not an expert in, it's soil blocking. I don't want to give any misinformation or lead you astray with this, so I will link in a couple other experts in this area, and I would definitely recommend checking them out for some more support or insight on how to get started with soil blocking. But just in a very general sense, a soil blocker is this metal concoction, and on the bottom there are a series of cells, kind of like that larger cell we were just looking at, that seed cell tray. And what you do is you pack those little cells with soil, and then you would find some sort of a tray, and you would push them out with a spring-loaded handle onto the tray, and you'd be left with a bunch of these little tiny soil blocks, literal blocks of soil, floating on the surface of your tray that you would be starting your seeds in. This is a wonderful option if you're trying to minimize your plastic use in the garden, but I will say it is a little more time intensive. It's rougher on your hands. If you're starting a lot, your hands are going to get really dry. But with all that in mind, there are positives with it too. You can start many more seeds in a smaller footprint. You usually get a better root system with your plants. So something to consider. I love soil blocking. I'm just a little more well-versed in the old standard tray, if you will. So that is soil blocking. All right, so you have your seeds and you have what you're going to be starting your seeds in. The other thing you are really going to want is a calendar of some sort. I don't care what type of calendar you use. It can be on your phone, it can be on your laptop, it can be a paper calendar, whatever works best for you and your brain. I love a paper calendar for seed starting. There's something about being able to lay it out on the table in front of me, being able to write on it, being able to pick it up and cross things off throughout the season as I'm working through starting seeds, but whatever calendar works for you. And then this next bit is really important if you're starting your seeds indoors. So if you're like me and you're not fortunate enough to have a greenhouse quite yet, I always say yet because I'm hoping to get one in the next year or two. But if you're starting them indoors, you're going to want a little station set up with lights. So a lot of people think they can just fill their trays, pack them with seeds, and put them in front of a sunny window. And I wish that was the case, but it is unfortunately not going to work if you want really healthy seedlings. The issue with starting them inside of a sunny window is a lot of modern windows have UV coating on them, so it's already filtering out some of the important sunlight that your seedlings are going to need. And most windows, especially in this early season, are not going to give your plants enough hours of sunlight throughout the day. So you are going to want to purchase or obtain some sort of seed starting light. You can use a variety of lights. There are tabletop options that have like a bendy portion that you can put over your cells. There are fluorescent lights that you can purchase. I've never used the fluorescents, but I use a series of LED lights, and I have them hanging on a shelving unit. I find it works really well. I will link the exact lights that I use. They are by no means, again, the best option or the only option or the perfect option. So definitely look around and figure out what's going to work well for you and your space. But please don't set your little seedlings in front of a window. There's a term that you'll probably hear if you're getting into gardening, and it is leggy. And a leggy seedling is a failing seedling. Leggy means that your seedling is really stretching and it's searching for light, and it's growing really tall really quick while it's searching for light, but it grows so fastly that it might be at risk of flopping over. It's not going to create really strong stems that are going to support nice tall flowers. So get your lights and avoid leggy seedlings is my number one advice. So you have your seeds, your calendar, your seed starting trays, and your lights. There's just a couple other materials we need. If you're starting them indoors and you don't have like a really warm, cozy part of your house to tuck them in, you're gonna want a seed starting heat mat. You can get these again at your local garden store, Amazon, Home Depot, Lowe's, all of those places. And usually a heat mat will come with a thermometer regulator. So this helps to regulate the temperature of that heat mat. It prevents it from getting too cool or too hot. The only other physical material you're going to want to obtain is your seed starting soil. So this is going to be the medium that you're going to be filling your trays with and setting your little seeds into. I will be sharing my soil recipe in just a little bit here, but you don't need to use my recipe. If you want to bypass that, and if that seems like too much, you can always just get a bag of seed starting soil at your garden center as well. The last thing isn't necessarily a material that you're going to obtain, but it's something you need to look up, and that is your last frost date and your first frost date. These are dates that you can just do a simple Google search for, and they're dates that vary depending on where you live. So I am in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and as most of you may know, we get pretty harsh winters here. And there is a day in spring where the risk of frost drops and the risk of my plants getting hit with a hard frost becomes really low. That is what my last frost date is. And then on the opposite end, in fall, when we're nearing that cold season, there is a date where the risk of frost jumps back up. And that's my first frost date. That's when the risk of frost is really high. And you might be wondering, why is that important? We want to know those dates because we don't want to send our baby seedlings out into the garden too early, get them planted out into the field or into the garden beds, and have them get hit with a really intense frost and completely kill or wipe out all of the hard work you've been working on since early in spring or even late in winter. So that last frost date is exceptionally important for figuring out how early you can start your seeds and how early you can get them into the garden. And then that first frost date in fall is really important because you don't want to plant stuff out too close to that date and never get to see them bloom, or too close to that date and they get wiped out again from a hard frost. Once you have all of those materials, the next thing you want to do is read your seed packets. So the back of every seed packet is going to have some pretty universal information. There's going to be some little bits that I really want us to focus on as we're getting started. One being the life cycle of the plant or the type of the plant. Most seed packets are going to let you know if it's an annual. An annual is a flower that you need to start annually, hence the name, but you start it year after year after year. A perennial comes back every year. So you want to look for that information. You want to look for spacing, and that's important for figuring out how many plants am I actually going to plant out into the garden and how many seeds do I actually need to start. I always start a few more seedlings than I actually need in the garden, just because they're not all going to sprout. They may not all make it into your garden for a number of reasons. So start a little bit more than you need in the garden. I also find you can plant a little bit more tightly than you find on the back of most seed packets. Florette Flower has an online library, which is a wonderful resource, and she has done a lot of research on how close you can plant things while still having a healthy flowering plant. So I would recommend, say you're planting zinnias, which is what I'm looking at right now, type in on the Florette library zinnias and click into that, and you'll see how close she recommends planting things. And then something that's going to be really important for what we're doing today is how many weeks before your last frost, so before that spring date we were talking about, that you can start these indoors. So this one, for example, says start 4 weeks before the last frost. That's really simple to figure out. If your seed packet for some reason doesn't have those explicit instructions, it may have something like days to maturation. So that would be how many days from when you start the seed is it ready to be harvested, and you can use those dates to figure out your seed sowing schedule as well. But hopefully you're lucky and it tells you how many weeks before your last frost to start your flowers. Once you have that information, we want to go to our calendar and start figuring out our seed starting schedule. The first thing I'm going to do is Google my last frost date in Milwaukee. I'm going to keep it broad to Milwaukee, but you can also look this up by your zip code. Let's see what a couple different websites say. So this is the Old Farmer's Almanac. They're usually pretty good. They say my last spring frost will be around April 25th. Okay. Let's see what this website says. And this website says May 1st to May 10th. So some websites are telling me April 25th. Some are saying we could get a frost as late as May 10th. And these are just estimates. They are not an exact science. They are looking back on previous years and taking the best guess. So I'm going to go with the conservative one. That website said it could be as late as May 10th that I'll get a frost. So I'm going to take May 10th as my last frost date. And I am going to write that down on the calendar. Once I have my last frost written out on my calendar, I'm going to look at my seed packets and see how early they recommend starting the seed. These are the zinnias that I'll actually be starting with you today. And they say sow into 72 cell flats 4 weeks before last frost. So 4 weeks before that date we just wrote down, I can start these plants indoors. Hopefully you can see all of this, but I'm going to find that last frost date I wrote down, and I'm going to remember my zinnias can be started 4 weeks before that date. So I'm going to count back 4 weeks. 1, 2, 3, 4. So April 12th would be 4 weeks before, and I'm going to write on there, start zinnias. And now that is the earliest I can start my zinnias this year. Now it's not the only time I could start zinnias. I could keep planting and planting so that I have a flush of them throughout the season. That's something called succession planting, and we're not going to go into that today, but it is something that exists and it's something you could look up if you were interested. Let's do one more packet together. So this is celosia, a different plant entirely, and the instructions on this say sow into 72 cell flat or preferred seedling container 6 to 8 weeks before the last frost date. So I could go as early as 8 weeks before my last frost date or 6 weeks. I don't like to leave things in those cells for too long, so I'm going to go with the 6 weeks that it recommends. So here's my last frost date again, and I'm going to count back 6 weeks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And same thing, here I'm going to write start celosia. I'm going to go through that same process with all of my seeds until I have my calendar mapped out, and then I'm going to follow this like a schedule. So for example, with the celosia, I have that marked down on March 29th. That is the earliest I can start those seeds. So I'm going to wait for that day to arrive, and that's when I will plug these into trays like I'm just about to show you. Now that we have all of our materials, I'm going to walk you through my soil starting recipe, and then we are going to fill some trays and start some seeds, which is really exciting. Now, the reason I have a soil recipe and I don't just use the bag from the garden center is it's packed with a lot more nutrients. So I don't need to feed my plants with something like a fish emulsion or a liquid fertilizer while they're waiting to get planted out into the field. I can usually just leave them in their cells until they're ready to go. So let's start with my soil recipe. My recipe is a combination of a bunch of other recipes from some really knowledgeable growers. So Blossom and Branch Flower Farm, I believe she's out of Colorado. I use a lot of her foundations for this recipe, and it is peat free, which is really exciting. I have been peat free here on the flower farm for about 4 years now. So I've avoided the use of peat by using this as well. The first thing you're going to want is your soil medium, and I use FoxFarm Coco Loco Potting Mix. And it can be a little coarse, so I have this strainer that fits perfectly on top of a bucket, and I run that potting soil through the strainer into the bucket, removing any large chunks. You're going to need 4 parts soil, and it doesn't matter what measuring utensil we're using, it's all by ratio. So I'm going to do 4 scoops of my Coco Loco potting mix. Okay, so 4 scoops of Coco Loco just went in, and I'm going to set that off to the side. Okay, now the next part of the recipe is cocoa coir, and when you order this or pick it up at your garden center, it's often going to come in a brick that is dehydrated, so you'll need to rehydrate it. Hot tip, use warm water when you're rehydrating it. Your hands are going to be digging around in this soil, so it might as well be warm and not frigid. Your seedlings are also going to like that warmth as we're getting them going. And it takes a lot more water than you think to rehydrate this block. By the time you saturate it with water, it should be pretty light and fluffy. So you can see I'm crumbling it here. And when you squeeze it, it may form up a little bit, but you can still crumble it relatively easy. We are going to add 1.5 parts cocoa coir to that potting mix. Now, if you don't want to add cocoa coir to your recipe, just add another 1.5 scoops of the potting mix and you'll be just fine. Now, the next ingredient is something I stumbled upon a couple years ago. This company is called Down to Earth, and they are amazing. Their staff is extremely knowledgeable and will be able to answer almost any question you bring to them. And if they don't have the answer, they figure it out, which is amazing. And I was asking them just a couple questions about some fertilizer options for my seedlings so that I'm not needing to feed them until they go out into the garden. And they recommended this starter mix. So this is an organic certified fertilizer, which is amazing. And it comes in like a granular powder form. With this one, I would follow the instructions on the box to figure out how much to add to your recipe. That's going to vary a little bit depending on the size of the scoop that you're using for your potting mix and that cocoa coir. For me, I'm going to do about 1/4 of a cup. Two more ingredients to go. The next thing I'm going to add is some mycorrhizae, and this is something that is additionally going to provide some really good nutrient density to the soil. Fresh new bag. This is something that when you open it, it does go bad. So you don't want to store this season after season. That's something actually the guy at my local garden center taught me. For this, we're also just going to do a little sprinkling, probably a tablespoon amount. One of the last things I'm going to add is some cinnamon. The reason I'm adding cinnamon is it cuts down on algae growth in your cells while you're starting them indoors. You might notice, even with this, some green kind of popping up on the top surface of your cells, but this really helps to cut down on that. I just do a nice sprinkling of that on top as well. From there, I'm going to go in with my hands or a scraper, and I'm just going to mix all of that soil matter together. And then I'm going to use just that same bowl I was using before to add some water. This is not an exact science. It really depends on how moist your potting soil was, how moist your coco coir was, but I'm going to add a little bit of water in here. Your soil shouldn't be sopping, but it should be moist. Once the water's in, you're going to mix it again until it's really well incorporated. And I would say a test for knowing if your soil is too moist is when you squeeze it, tiny little drips may come out, but there should not be a stream of water gushing from that soil. Again, it should gather nicely if you're squeezing it, but you should be able to easily crumble it again. Now that your soil is mixed, we're going to fill a tray. You're going to take that dough mop, we'll use that in just a little bit, and set it off to the side. And you're going to remove your seed cells from that bottom tray. You can set that bottom tray just off to the side. I like to have my soil pushed up against the back here so that I can nestle my tray in like this. Then I'm going to scoop the soil into the cells. You may have noticed I laid out newspaper on my dining room table. I normally start all of these in my basement on a big work surface that I'm okay getting dirt all over, but dirt can definitely scratch a wooden table if you're not careful. So if you are using your nice dining room table as a work surface, keep that in mind. Once it looks like the tray is relatively filled, I'm going to give it a little tap. By tapping it, I'm removing any air pockets that were sitting beneath the level of the soil. So now I'm going to put it back into my green container over here and just top fill it one last time. And she's done. Now that our tray is filled, I'm going to go through with my finger and make just the smallest little divot. I am not really pushing down at all. I'm just letting my finger rest on the soil to create a little divot where my seed is going to get nestled. From here, we're going to go in with our seeds, and today I'm just starting some zinnias. Again, this is a great flower to start with if you're a beginner. Zinnia seeds are a really good size, so they're easy to work with. I like to pour these out into my hand and then put them into the cells. You can also tap them out of your seed packet. Now, if you are starting with a smaller seed, I recommend going in with a toothpick or a chopstick, and if you moisten the end of the toothpick, it will actually pick up your seed, and you can put them in the tray that way. You may notice I'm putting 2 seeds in each cell. The reason I'm doing this is not every single seed is going to germinate and sprout. By putting 2 in here, I'm just increasing the chances that I will have a viable seedling in every cell of this tray. It is totally fine to put just 1 seedling in. Just know you might have some gaps in your tray and not every seed is likely going to sprout. Once your seeds are in, I'm going to go through and just apply some light pressure. Again, just almost tapping on them, not quite pushing down, making sure the seed is making really good contact with the soil. Once your seeds are in their trays, you want to look at the back of your packet and figure out how much the seeds want to be covered. As a general rule of thumb, the larger seeds like to be covered more and the smaller seeds like to be covered less, but definitely check your packet. You can cover your seeds with a couple different things. You can use the same soil medium we use to fill our trays, so you can use any extra seed starting mix you have to cover them. or totally optional, and that's why I didn't include it on the materials list, but you can use vermiculite to cover the seeds as well. That helps to cut down on that algae growth on the top. So I'll be sprinkling with vermiculite today. If you don't want that option, and if you don't want to add another thing to your materials list, just use the soil that we used before. Zinnias are a larger seed, so they can take a little bit more covering. You can see they're still peeking through the vermiculite, but they're definitely covered relatively well. I am now going to replace the humidity dome and get these guys tucked on a heat mat under some grow lights. There's no way around this terrible backlighting with the grow lights on, but I'm going to tuck my heat mat onto the shelf, and I am going to make sure my heat mat is plugged into my thermometer control. Now, it may be challenging to see, but I want to make sure my thermometer is set to maintain a temperature around 70 degrees. 70 degrees is usually a good temperature for your heat mat, though you can always look at the back of your seed packet to figure out what that particular variety likes. This is set a little warm, so now I have it set to 70. From there, I'm going to slide those seeds that we just started onto the heat mat, and my little temperature gauge has a little thermometer probe that I'm going to slip just underneath the dome and into the soil. That's going to communicate with the heat mat to make sure it doesn't get too hot or too cold. I have my grow lights set to a timer. Mine are set to turn on at 6 a.m. and they turn off at 9 p.m. You usually want to shoot for anywhere from 14 to even 18 hours of light for these guys every day. You want to check in on your seedlings every couple days, making sure the soil is staying moist. If you're finding it's getting dry, you want to do something called bottom watering. So I have filled that bottom tray that sits beneath the cells with water, and I am simply going to place my seeds over top. I'm going to let this sit here for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then I'll dump out the excess water from the tray beneath. I will keep my eye on these guys. Again, bottom watering when I need to, making sure the soil is staying nice and moist. And in about 7 days for zinnias, I would expect to see some green little sprouts forming. When about 70% of the tray has sprouted, I will remove the dome light and continue caring for these guys until it's time to plant them out after my last frost. Thank you so much for watching today from my dining room of all places. I hope you feel like you have some basic foundation skills now to start your own seeds and start your own cutting garden. Definitely subscribe to the page and turn on notifications so you don't miss any updates as I continue sharing what happens with that little tray we started today and what it looks like when I plant out the thousands and thousands of seedlings that I start from my basement in spring.